Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about the Leica M4-P, which I borrowed for about a month from my friend Dan. This is obviously not that camera, but let's get into it. My friend Dan was kind enough to let me borrow his M4-P for a month after he got his M6, which I really do appreciate. And I waited a long time to make this video until I really got truly intimately comfortable with my Zeiss icon, the Icon, which is obviously not that camera, but it's something I'm going to kind of compare to a little bit and refer to in certain ways. And I also just need something to do with my hands. I'm also framing this video as an example of a Leica because it's the only Leica I've used for any significant period of time. And if you're looking for discussion about Canadian versus German Leicas, not only am I unqualified to make that discussion happen, I do not care. Manufactured from 1981 to 1986, the M4-P is the third in the M4 sub-series of Leica cameras, following the M4-II and the M4, and it adds a few extra features that those cameras didn't have that in many ways make this a meterless Leica M6, and it's quite a popular choice for people looking to get into the Leica system without quite breaking the bank given Leica M6 hype prices. It's a purely mechanical camera with no electronics and no light meter, shooting standard 35mm film, 24x36mm negatives, and using a rangefinder focusing mechanism where you're not looking directly through the lens, but getting a representation or an approximation of what the lens is actually seeing. This camera uses the M mount, Leica's bayonet rangefinder mount that's over 70 years old this year, which has nearly flawless compatibility stretching through the mount's history, with limited exceptions for certain lens and camera body combinations here and there. And you can also access the entire library of LTM and M39 lenses using an appropriate adapter. Removing the lens cap, you can see the cloth focal plane shutter with speeds ranging from 1/1000th of a second down to 1 second in whole stop steps, plus bulb mode. To the left of the mount lies the lens release button, the lights logo, and the rewind switch to decouple the advance so you can rewind your film when you finish a roll. We'll come back to the rest in a bit. There are two strap lugs, one on each side, and the removable base plate has a standard 1/4 tripod socket and a lock to remove the plate for loading film. Yeah, Leica's M bodies don't use a traditional rear door mechanism, and there are certain advantages to the way that they do it. In short, after you take the base plate off and lift up the back door, pull the film leader out and drop the film into the camera from the bottom, making sure that the leader sits properly between the forks, and pop the plate back on. There is a bit more nuance to that here, but that is a simplified version because I'm not really the best person to explain it. The rear door doesn't have a rotating ISO dial, instead just a plate that's labelled, and you're supposed to mark it with a soft pencil to remind you which ISO of film you have loaded. Above the door are two separate sync ports for M and X flashbulbs and the viewfinder window. The M4-P's viewfinder has a magnification of 0.72x, which is the closest thing to a standard for modern M-mount bodies. Because this is a rangefinder, the series of windows on the upper front of the body are the actual rangefinder mechanism and frameline illumination windows. When you attach a lens, one of three pairs of frame lines are shown in the finder: 35 and 135mm, 50 and 75mm, or 28 and 90mm. Which sets of frame lines actually show up are controlled by a protrusion on the lens bayonet that just pushes down on a little lever, and the frameline selection lever on the front of the body allows you to manually bring up different sets of frame lines, either if you're using a lens that brings up the wrong set of frame lines on your camera, or if you want to just preview what a different focal length looks like without having to actually change lens first. The rangefinder itself is parallax corrected, with both the rangefinder patch and the frame lines moving downwards to the right as you focus down to the rangefinder's own minimum focusing distance of 70 centimeters. I spoke about the shutter speed range earlier, but the shutter dial has an extra lightning bolt symbol for the max flash sync speed of 1/50th of a second, and this camera has a hot shoe in addition to the sync ports on the back, not just a cold shoe. The advanced lever is a single stroke type with a less masculine shape than some of the older Leica cameras, and the large shutter button has a socket for a standard threaded cable release. The frame counter is black on white, and the convex lens makes it easy to see your shot count under basically any lighting condition. After toggling the rewind lever on the front of the body, the angled rewind crank at the top turns smoothly and honestly far more ergonomically than it might seem. Again, this video was focused more on the M4P as an example of a Leica rather than specifically the nitty-gritty details of the M4P versus every other model. But it's worth noting that a lot of these things will still apply to most Leicas or other rangefinders in general. Regardless, the build quality is absolutely incredible. There are some things that I really dislike with the build quality of the Zeiss Icon, which I'll talk about whenever I do make a video about it. But the overall experience, I mean, Leicas are expensive cameras. They are luxury tools and they lack a lot of features that other cameras have. But my God, do they feel amazing to use. The smoothness of the advanced lever, the brightness and clarity of the rangefinder patch, the smoothness of the lenses. He has some Summicron and some Lux lenses. And even just the overall feel of turning the shutter dial or using the base plate. It's a very bougie experience, for lack of a better way to put it, and it doesn't feel forced, it just genuinely feels like a high quality instrument, because it is. That cloth focal plane shutter is very, very quiet, making it very easy to be stealthy, either if you just need to be discreet and not disturb, say, a musical performance, or if you're in a museum, or just for classical street photography, to be able to take a picture without drawing too much attention to yourself. That works really nicely, and it's certainly something I appreciate compared to a lot of my other cameras. As far as Leicas go, it's very affordable given the feature set. It's one of the most well-rounded options overall in the M-mount system, and again, it's basically a meterless M6 in the broad sense. So if you're happy either using an external light meter, either on the hot shoe or your phone, or just using Sunny 16, it's a really good way to get into the Leica M-mount system. This is a bit of a double whammy, but one, being a Leica with the legacy behind that brand, and two, being fully mechanical unlike something like a CLE or the M7, means basically anyone can repair them and do a really good job. I can send my Rolleiflex or the Zeiss Icon off for some work in some places, but not everywhere is able to work on them or do what I want, and it's going to cost a lot more. A good CLA or general servicing for a Leica, the mechanical ones at least, is very broadly available, and I want to take this opportunity to give a huge shout out to Alan from Amsterdam Camera Repair, ACR, because he does incredible work. I follow his Instagram stories and you can see the level of detail he goes into when he's taking care of people's cameras is absolutely incredible. If you're in Europe and you're looking for a really thorough, it's not even a CLA, it's more like a rebuild and full service and overhaul, have a look at Alan's stuff. It might be worth sending your camera there. He didn't ask me to say that. He doesn't know about this or anything, but I speak to Alan a lot and I really get on with him, and his work is genuinely incredible. The M-mount gives you access to a tremendous breadth of lenses, whether it's using actual M-mount lenses from Leica or more budget-friendly alternatives like Light Lens Lab, Zeiss, Lomography even, MS Optics, Voigtlander. You have a wide range of options for native lenses with rangefinder coupling, and if you want to go for something older or perhaps more niche, you even can just get a thread mount adapter to bring up the appropriate frame lines and access the whole breadth of screw mount lenses, say from Canon or Nikkor especially. Those lenses are generally very, very good lenses, and they're very affordable for the most part, with obviously some collectible options out there that are a bit more expensive, but you can go through a whole spectrum of price versus quality with just rangefinder lenses with LTM and M-mount, and that really is worth driving home. Like, you are not going to be stuck for options, and the M4P having all of the frame lines to use all these common lenses really means you can do whatever you want. The fact that you're not composing through the lens, just through this viewfinder, means you can stack an infrared filter or an ND filter or whatever you want on the lens, and it's not going to interfere with your composition. That really is worth a lot. Even just using an orange filter can throw off my ability to see what I'm doing with an SLR that well. Yellow filter is not so bad. Orange, sometimes I have to take it off and put it back on when I'm ready to take the shot. With a rangefinder, you don't have to worry about that because you're not looking directly through the lens. And that's especially important for strong ND filters, say for fast film or wide apertures in the middle of the day, or if you want to use an infrared film. You're not going to be able to see through the infrared filter basically at all. That's the point, because they block visible light. But you can still just shoot freely with the rangefinder, and I love doing that, and that's something that's really advantageous when it comes to these rangefinder cameras. For all their benefits, rangefinder cameras do have a lot of inherent flaws, the main one being parallax. I'm composing through this viewfinder, not through the lens, so there is a distinct difference in where these two are both looking. Parallax correction in the viewfinder does help with this, but it doesn't completely eliminate it. And aside from that, focus breathing means that frame lines are only ever truly accurate at about 2 meters for most cameras and most lenses. At farther distances, you're going to get slightly less than what the frame lines show you. At close distances, you're going to get slightly more. The extent of that breathing is going to vary by lens and focal length, but it is worth bearing in mind. A rangefinder frame line is very much a suggestion. Oh, and because you don't have a meter in the body, it's not going to tell you if you've left the lens cap on. So you're going to need to keep an eye on that. Blank frames are kind of a thing with rangefinders, but thankfully my rangefinders all have meters. So I'm able to see, you know, if I'm shooting at f2 and I'm seeing an exposure time of more than a second in the middle of the day, I know I've got the lens cap on. Not every camera will actually flag that for you. So it's something you need to get into the habit of checking. The M4P gets a lot of hate for a lot of different things, but one thing I do actually agree with is the position and size of the red dot. It's absolutely huge, it's in a weird position on the front of the body, and let's be honest, if you're buying a Leica, you are at least a little bit vain, or you're lying to yourself about not being vain. And the looks do matter, and most people, including me, don't really like the red dot on this camera. I much prefer the smaller, higher up dot of something like an M6 if I were going to get a Leica, which I'm not. There are people who absolutely love the design of this camera and consider it their favorite though. It's something that a lot of people judge the M4P on, and I've seen people judge M4P owners for. Ergonomically, the shutter dial is very small and very short, so me with my bad hands, or if I'm wearing gloves when in winter, which is when I borrowed this camera, it can be a bit difficult to actually use the shutter dial properly. I mean, it's not that bad, but something like the Zeiss has a much larger, much easier to use, more clicky shutter dial that I appreciate a lot more. Again, this is a very personal thing, but it might be something that you prefer. There are various Leica cameras that have smaller and bigger shutter dials, so it's something that Leica have been playing with over the years. Bigger dials being a lot more common nowadays, and I think they've kind of learned their lesson from this era of film camera. The 0.72x magnification, the standard viewfinder for most M-mount bodies, is atrocious for a glasses wearer. 0.5x didn't exist in the M4P. I think that started with limited quantities of the M6, and then the M6 TTL and M7 really brought it forward. But like, this is about a 0.7x finder on the Zeiss, but it's a huge finder that physically doesn't even fit inside the body completely. So I can see with glasses, no problem. I can see at the 35 frame lines, no problem here. When I'm using the M4P, I really have to crane my eye around the viewfinder like I'm gonna make myself dizzy just to be able to see where the 35 lines are. And the 28, absolutely zero hope. I can barely see them in this camera. I can't see them in the M4P or any 0.72x Leica at all. There are people who always just say, oh, just take off your glasses or whatever. Like, yeah, you see a decisive moment. Let me just take these off, put them away, and the moment's gone. Depending on the kind of photography you do, that may or may not be a problem, but for me, that's not something I'm willing to deal with. Or getting a diopter on the viewfinder. It doesn't really work. For me, as a glasses wearer, the 0.72x Leicas are simply unviable because I use 35mm lenses. If you only use a 50 or 50 or longer, it's actually quite a good option, but most people I know use a 28 or a 35 as well as a longer lens, and there it's really hard to recommend one of these cameras on that basis. You could, of course, use a cold shoe 35 or 28mm finder, but then you're going back and forth between finders, which I personally don't like doing either. Unlike an SLR camera where the aperture stays wide open until you actually take the picture, in most cases, with rangefinder lenses, if you set the aperture to f16, it's at f16. If I set it wide open, it's wide open, because there's no need to snap it down because you're not composing through the lens anyway. But that means with a cloth shutter camera like the M4P, you have to be mindful not to burn a hole in it, pointing the camera at the sun and just leaving it there for a while, whether you're waiting to take a shot on a tripod or you're just having coffee and leave your camera on the table. You can actually burn a pinhole into the shutter, and that can be a bit of a problem. You can actually see that this happened to this exact camera before Dan picked it up, and the shutter was repaired and it works fine now, but it's just something to be aware of. And especially this being a common entry point into the Leica M system, I feel like it's worth mentioning as something to be aware of if it's your first rangefinder or first cloth shutter camera in general. Compared to the brass top and bottom plates of most Leica M cameras, the zinc top and bottom plates of the M4P and I think some M6s can cause this kind of bubbling thing. I'll put some pictures on screen where basically the zinc corrodes and the plate needs to either be replaced if you want to get rid of this, or you just have to live with it because it's not something you can stop from happening once it starts. From what I've read, once it starts, it's kind of unstoppable, and how bad it gets will depend on a range of factors, and no one seems to really agree what technically causes it, but it happens with the zinc top and bottom plate, and this camera has those, so it's something you might need to be mindful of. Or if you don't care, you might be able to use that as a way to score a really good deal. Again, this is one of the reasons that I prefer this Zeiss Icon over actual Leica, but the maximum flash sync speed on the M4-P is just 1/50th of a second, which is quite slow, and that's because it's a cloth shutter. They don't physically move as fast as super fancy titanium or foil shutters. That's just the way it is. That's why the Pentax 6.7 has such a bad flash sync speed compared to something like the Hasselblad 2000 FCM, 1/30th versus 1/90th for a giant 6x6 shutter. This can flash sync at 1/125, 1/125th of a second. And that's something that I really appreciate having. Personally, 1/50th is a little bit too slow for me for flash photography most of the time. Again, it depends on your needs and what you're going to be doing, but you need to be aware that it's not exactly a speed demon there. So those are my thoughts on Dan's Leica M4-P, and thank you again so much for letting me borrow it, especially for so long. Again, I wanted to kind of get more use and familiarity with my Zeiss before I made this video, and I'm glad that I did, because with the benefit of hindsight and my current experiences with that camera, I really feel more reassured in my decisions. You know, I prefer using flash a lot, so the faster flash sync speed makes a lot of sense. I shoot with faster film, pushing Delta 3200 to 50,000. So being able to shoot at 1/2000th of a second is nice. And the rear door suits me and my arthritic hands quite a bit better, just ergonomically. But there's no denying the magic of using a Leica camera, and as nice as this camera is, it really can't hold a candle to the Leica experience, and the M4-P serves that up in spades. I see it much more as an entry point into the M ecosystem than I do a particularly amazing camera in itself. Like, it doesn't have a light meter, it doesn't have the best build quality within the Leica world, it doesn't have the brass top and bottom plates. The Lights logo is in the wrong place and far too large for too many people. All of those things keep the price down though and make it a very accessible and relatively affordable entry point into this system. And again, you don't have to go and buy Leica M lenses. You can just go and buy a couple of Voigtlanders for a few hundred each and really get access to some amazing glass and the rangefinder experience without having to completely break the bank, which is probably something you're mindful of if you're buying an M4-P. Would I buy one myself? Probably not for the reasons that I've said, but I'm really glad that I got this experience just to get the context and really reaffirm my decision to buy this thing and gain some appreciation for what Leica's offer. I mean, you can look at them through the lens of paying more for fewer features and that being stupid, but then if you own more than half a dozen books in a world where Kindles exist, someone could say the same thing to you. Maybe not on the same financial scale, but it's definitely, you know, a similar kind of mindset thing. I'm really glad that I got to try this camera out, and if you have any questions about it, I'd be happy to put you in contact with Dan if I can't help you myself. Give Dan a follow though, he's an amazing photographer. He doesn't post too much of his stuff online, but it's worth keeping an eye out for when he does post, because when he does, it's usually a set of bangers. That's all I have to say for this video, so stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.